Hey, it's your pal Al here once again on Al's Geek Lab. Today on the Geek Lab, I thought I would take a retrospective view of the top 10 games of the first decade of the PC. I've made a video of each of the years from 1981, when the PC first came out, all the way through to 1991. And today I thought I would surmise all of those videos into one little video. So for your viewing pleasure, let's roll the tape. In 1977, Apple brought out the Apple II computer, followed quickly by the Tandy TRS-80 and the Commodore PET. This trinity of microcomputers brought computing to the home. Before then, it was only really mainframes and mini-computers, way too large to fit onto a desk or a kitchen table, and could cost tens or even hundreds of thousands of dollars. IBM were late to this show. They saw the advancing home computer market and wanted a piece of the action. Maybe even for the business market. It wasn't until August 12, 1981 that IBM released the first microcomputer for that market. It was called the IBM 5150 Personal Computer. It sported a 4.77 MHz Intel 8088 CPU, and it was an overnight success, despite having some interesting problems. For example, the Apple II was capable of colour all of its life. At the original PC release, it only had a monochrome display. A colour graphics adapter was released, however a colour monitor did not get released by IBM until 1983. Most people who bought an IBM PC bought it for small business purposes. Spreadsheets, word processing, databases. That PC didn't have graphics in mind. And that's why in 1981 almost all of the games were text-based. IBM released a port of the original Colossal Cave text adventure game with the PC. And on your screen here, you can see the efforts of Bill Gates and Neil Thompson of a 6-year-old then Microsoft. Apparently they coded this game to show off what the IBM's built-in BASIC could do. Hardly impressive, but this is one of the very first games for the PC. So pretty much by default, this gets the number 1 spot for 1981. As mentioned, the processor of choice in the IBM PC was an 8088. It differed in specifications to that of its contemporaries, where most microcomputers at the time were running 8-bit CPUs such as MOS Technologies 6502 or the Zilog Z80. The 8088 and its slightly bigger brother, the 8086, were 16-bit CPUs and had only been around a year when the PC shipped. On top of this, IBM were extremely secretive about the PC during its design phase. People like Bill Gates had to stay in a locked room and sign NDAs just to see the prototypes. Needless to say, all of this meant that nobody really knew how to write software for the IBM. By the time 1982 rolled along, a few trepidatious software developers had embarked on understanding the PC. Many software houses popped up to take a chance on the IBM and ported games from other platforms. Some pioneers even wrote games from scratch, although there were many imitations. Firstly, Snipes was a pretty original game. Although in low-res text mode, it was pretty novel for its time, even to the point of supporting multiplayer gaming over an IPX network. Next here is Fuzzy Worm, a clone of the popular arcade classic Caterpillar. Here's an example of an original for the PC, as far as I know. It's Paratrooper. It was a great game too, although it wore a bit thin after about 10 minutes of play. It did show potential. The next one is another port, Burger Time. It featured on literally dozens of platforms. The PC port, like so many early PC ports, was not great, the graphics and sound being hilariously bad. However, the gameplay was still there, and as a result, I've personally wasted many hours playing that game. The number 1 game of 1982 chosen by me I'd rated was Boxer Rebellion. This game was kinda similar to Quicks, but definitely not a clone. It was half puzzle, half action. You had to skirt around each box to complete the level. But as their levels advance, the more baddies are on the course. Basic as it looked, the gameplay was actually pretty compelling. Although Burger Time was a very close second for me. Finally, the IBM PC received a dedicated monitor for the 4-color CGA adapter in 1983. The IBM 5153 was a well-engineered graphics monitor that was paired to go with the IBM Color Graphics Adapter, or CGA for short. Also in 1983, the PC standard evolved just a little bit. The PC XT came out. XT stood for Extended Technology. Rather than having just 2 floppy drives, the XT sported a 10MB hard drive by default. Rather than 16K of RAM by default, it shipped with a minimum of 128K, and the number of expansion bays went from 5 to 8. This extension was definitely an incremental update, however the extra RAM and the addition of a hard drive caused some developers to open their eyes to possibilities on the horizon. The contemporary 8-bit computers like the Commodore 64 would only support 64K of RAM, whereas the PC could support up to 640K, and using a hard drive wasn't very practical on the Commodores, Apple IIs and Tandy machines of the time. There were loads of popular games in 1983, again mostly ports or imitations. Lode Runner was a massive hit, especially on the Apple II, so Broderbund Software ported it to the PC and it was a pretty faithful port. However, the number one pick for me in 1983 was Digger by Windmill Software. It was kind of a cross between Dig Dug and Mr. Do. You don't have a puka, but you mined all day picking up bags of gold and trying to escape the baddies. To me, it was way more fun than Dig Dug and Mr. Do, and I like both of these games, so it was an easy pick for me to make. The sound was almost digitized. Some of the best work that the PC Beeper had produced to date was realised by this game. The graphics were also pretty colourful and nice compared to the usual cyan and magenta palette commonly used for CGA. (1984) brought 2 important changes to the PC hardware line. IBM released 2 new standards. The PC-AT, which stood for Advanced Technology. It shipped with a minimum of 256K RAM, but often had 640K and was capable of theoretically hosting up to 16MB. The engine was based around the Intel 286 chip, running at either 6 or 8 MHz. It was at least double the speed of the original PC. Unlike the 8088, it was a true 16-bit CPU with a 16-bit bus. The system paved the way for a whole host of standards which would stay with the PC well into the 2000s. The AT could ship with the monochrome display adapter, the good old 4-color CGA adapter, but you could also get the brand new EGA adapter, the enhanced graphics adapter. And its companion monitor, the 5154, could provide 16 colours simultaneously on the screen from a palette of 64. It was a massive improvement over CGA, with a high resolution of 640 by 350, not quite the 640 of the upcoming VGA a few years later, but it was certainly good enough for the graphical apps and games of 1984. Sadly though, most games didn't make use of this hardware until nearer the end of EGA's life. As for the games of 1984, much like 1983 before it, the games were a mixture of ports and clones. A few unique titles were made, such as Sopwith by BMB CompuScience, a frustrating but addictive 2D flight shooter which had realistic gravity physics. For its time, also a pretty good AI enemy, should you choose to fight against the computer. Also, there was Alley Cat, and although it came out for other platforms such as the Atari, I've only ever seen it on a PC. Many people who had a PC at the time have also played this classic. It's great fun, not really anything about it that I would say was bad. Cheery little bits of music, non-linear gameplay, decent CGA graphics. I know. Epyx's Pit Stop was also a great game. Compared with its Commodore 64 version, this CGA version was a real dunger. However, despite its obvious graphical failings, it was still a first decent racing game for a PC. It introduced an element of realism. You can see your tyres wearing out during corner turns, and your fuel trickles down before you're forced to pit. 2-player mode meant that you were battling it out on opposing sides of the keyboard in a split-screen mode, something that was pretty novel for its time. Finally, there was King's Quest. This game really shook things up. Until then, adventure games were not animated. Sierra created the first graphical adventure game, but in 1984 they made another first. It was the first adventure game that you could walk your character around with the cursor keys. Landscapes and objects would appear 3D, or at least 2.5 dimension if you like that. Suddenly, a whole genre of adventure games opened up in its footsteps. Games such as Space Quest, Police Quest, Quest for Glory, Day of the Tentacle, Monkey Island, they all owe its roots to this one game. Conceived and designed by Roberta Williams, King's Quest was brought about partially by funding from IBM, who wanted to have Sierra make a game that would showcase the capabilities of its new computer, codenamed Peanut. The PC Junior, as it became known, had a slightly improved colour palette over CGA. It could display 16 colours at a resolution of 320 by 200 or 4 colours at 640 by 200. King's Quest took full advantage of the 16 colour palette. Roberta made an excellent game. The story had depth, the character was likeable, the animation and graphics was playful and colourful respectively. It's little wonder that King's Quest went on to have 7 sequels. Whilst the specifications of PC hardware didn't change that much in 1985 or 1986, the attack of the clones had well and truly started. Why spend $1,000 or $2 more on the IBM badge when you could buy a clone PC that would be just as fast, if not faster, than the IBM equivalent? Many of these clones were 100% IBM compatible, some not so much. Either way, one of the best things about the IBM PC was now a curse for IBM, its open architecture. The PC was no longer just an IBM computer. 1985 was the year of the RPG. Many solid titles such as Ultima 4 and The Bard's Tale were soaring near top spots on the game's charts. I never really got into RPGs, so I didn't really feel right putting them in the number 1 spots on my videos, much to the disappointment of many RPG fans that have watched these videos. Sorry about that. Other fun games in 1985 were games like Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego, one of the earlier edutainment titles. It was good, clean fun for children and adults, and had a number of follow-up titles. Finally, Striker was a good fun game, a 2D helicopter game where you had to avoid oncoming enemies or shoot them down. You had to rescue a bunch of hostages. It's more fun than it sounds. I like to think of 1986 as the year that the IBM PC shifted into second gear. Now, whilst the EGA standard of 16 colours was already well available, many games still held on to that 4-colour CGA, and of course the PC speaker was the only choice for sound. There was no sound cards for the PC, so in 1986, despite the new fancy 386 processor being out, a lot of games just didn't cut the mustard. And if you had a look at the other consoles and computers that were out in 1986, the Sega Master System, the Atari 7800, the Mac Plus, the Apple IIgs, the Amiga 1000, and of course the great games for the Commodore 64 just kept on coming. Games like Sentinel with their amazing 3D graphics. Where was the PC in all of this? Well, I'd have to say that it was somewhat languishing. Despite my moans and groans, there were tons of great games in 1986, including Nightfire, Round 42 here, 2-on-2 Basketball, Dragons, Ninja, Gunship, and Karateka, to name but a few. But all of these titles, I'm a sucker for Sierra games, and a number 1 spot was awarded to Space Quest. The humour was great, and the story of a hapless space janitor come accidental hero parodying all of the famous space TV and movies in one 3D animated adventure made for some laughed out loud fun, which was not provided by any other game before then, in my opinion. By 1987, IBM were losing control. The Clone War was fought and had been won. The PC, XT and AT were being copied by companies like Compaq, Dell, HP and lesser known brands all over the world. IBM had to do something. In April of 1987, IBM released the third generation of the PC called the PS2. Despite its initial success, people quickly discovered it offered little in the way of backwards compatibility with peripherals that people already had. Much of the off-the-shelf hardware was using previous open architecture ISA or eISA standard expansion hardware, replacing it with their proprietary MCA or micro-channel architecture. Worse still, they made hardware manufacturers pay licensing rights to use this hardware interface. Before long, the battle was lost, and Big Blue lost their dominance of the home computer market over the following years. What endured were the standards that IBM originally created. The last major open standard that IBM produced was also in 1987, Video Graphics Array, commonly known as VGA. VGA was such a successful standard that even today's graphics adapters are based on VGA. Initially, VGA supported 256 colours and a 640 by 480 resolution, but over the years went up to support 1080p. VGA didn't become widely used in games until around 1990, but 1987 is where it all started. Another important thing to know about 1987 is the introduction of audio cards such as the AdLib sound card. Let's have a look at the differences between games in CGA, EGA and VGA with different versions of sound cards as well. Back to the games though, Bad Street Brawler, a 2D side-scrolling beat-em-up, got the thumbs up for originality, and despite Lucasfilm making a couple of games before Maniac Mansion, this was the first game of theirs that I played. It introduced the SCUM interface, which was a huge departure from the command interpreters of Sierra adventure games. You could use a mouse to point-and-click operations such as open and push, rather than having to type ambiguous commands into a parser. I never finished the game though. Maybe I was impatient. Maybe I didn't buy into the characters, or maybe I didn't like the story all that much. Either way, all of that was remedied by the follow-up game, Day of the Tentacle, which was released in 1992. Another very popular game of 87 was Arkanoid. On the surface, it looked just like another Breakout clone, but what it did was very well executed. I don't think there's ever been another Breakout game that got close since. Other favourites of mine in 1987 included Test Drive, which I wasted far too many hours on. I also plopped Space Quest 2 at second place. I actually preferred Space Quest 2 over Space Quest 1, but I think that's because I played Space Quest 2 before I played Space Quest 1. I also found the artwork in Space Quest 2 more detailed, more compelling for some reason. Many people say that Space Quest 2 is the weakest game in the series, with the puzzles being irritating and the game being less funny. However, I have no such qualms. At the number one spot, it was going to be a pointless exercise to try and argue with me over my selection there. One of my all-time favourite games, a massively formative part of my youth, and at times a laugh-out-loud game. Leisure Suit Larry in the Land of the Lounge Lizards was a game like no other for me. Sure, it was prefaced by the text adventure soft porn, however it was only when Sierra paired it with the 3D adventure game Interpreter that the story of this 40-year-old virgin loser was set about on his quests to be rid of his virginity. Despite there being a VGA remake as well as a rebooted version, this original version is still my favourite one. Perhaps that's nostalgia talking to me, but there's just something about those blocky graphics that led more to the imagination. From 1987 onwards, selecting a top 10 was almost impossible. There were so many great games. By 1988, it was clear that developers were starting to make games for the PC first, and then porting them to other platforms. Games like Manhunter New York, which was Sierra's first attempt to deviate from the usual command parser of previous adventure games. Perhaps they were looking to compete with the SCUM interpreter in Lucasfilm's games. Either way, Manhunter was a beautifully drawn game which had no commands and pushed AGI to its limits. Continuing with the Sierra, King's Quest IV, Police Quest 2 and Leisure Suit Larry 2 were released, being the first games to use the new Sierra Creative Interpreter. Although SCI used commands, it supported new functionality including higher resolution graphics, AdLib and other digitized sound. Lucasfilm released another title with iterative improvements on their SCUM interface with the advent of Zack McCracken and the Alien Mindbenders, another solid title from Lucasfilm, who were definitely strong contenders to Sierra by this time. The Bitmap brothers had also made a name for themselves in the latter part of the 1980s, and Speedball set the tone for games to come over the next few years. The other big hits of the year were Rampage and California Games. California Games were one of the few games that pushed CGA to its limits, drawing more than the usual 4 colours out of its palette of 16. It used some pretty nifty tricks to pull that off. The number one pick for 1988, however, was awarded to Accolade's Grand Prix circuit. 4 years after Pit Stop 2, Grand Prix took that formula to the next level, pitting you against a whole track of Formula 1 contestants. The game was close to being a simulation, but it wasn't quite there. We'd have to wait to Indianapolis 500 for that. Like I said before, picking games for these latter years of the 80s was difficult. 1989 was one of the hardest. I trawled through hundreds of games, sandbox type games suddenly became big, Populous was huge, but SimCity was my favourite of those. I remember playing SimCity for days and days. There wasn't even a goal to the game, you'd just keep making your empire better and better. Whilst it looked crude in comparison to 1992's SimCity 2000, it was still plenty entertaining enough, and it was unlike anything I'd ever played before. Shuffle Puck Cafe was a simple bat and ball game, just a pick up and have fun kind of game. Some of those ones are the best. Another pick up and kind of play game was by Lucasfilm. Lucasfilm made a slight deviation from adventure games with Pipe Dreams, or Pipe Mania as it was known in some countries. Make sure you get a pipe network put together enough before the nasty sludge comes through it. That's all there was to it. Great fun. LucasArts also made an action game in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, but the graphic adventure which came out a few months afterwards was much more my sort of game. Back with Sierra, they made the RPG come adventure game Quest for Glory, which is an epic game. Depending on which character you chose, a fighter, a magician, or a thief, the story would play out differently. It was a great mixture of RPG and adventure game that was a real success, opening yet another franchise for Sierra's adventures. Test Drive 2 came out in 1989 and featured slightly improved graphics, more cars, a selection of optional add-on scenery and car packs. The most significant improvement, however, was the controls. The first game was hampered by the fact that you couldn't hold down accelerate buttons whilst you steered the car. This game fixed that, making it a whole heap more enjoyable. Great fun, grab a sports car from a yard, joyride the hell out of it, avoid the cops, rinse and repeat. Keeping it racing, Indianapolis 500 came out in 1989, one absolute stunner of a game. Pick it up today, it's still playable as all heck, and it drives just as good as many racers do today. The physics is spot on, the realism is all there, the graphics were absolutely stunning for its day. Really hard not to be a fan of Indy 500. My number one pick of 1989 though was Space Quest 3. Everything about Space Quest 3 was laugh a minute. This had to be the best humour off the Space Quest series. It was also one of the longer games, so a better bang for your buck too. In my opinion, this was also the best sounding Space Quest. Despite following games in the series having optional digitised speech, there was just something special about the Roland MT32 audio specifically. I mean, what do you expect? Supertramp's friggin' drummer Bob Segenberg did the music. People liked the soundtrack so much that it's been reimagined and released on vinyl and digital download. Check out the link in the description below for a link to that particular beauty. There were a lot of games that were what I'd call pick up and play in 1990. Many games that, whilst entertaining, they weren't long-lasting fun. Take Skyroads here, for example. By 1990, the PC was seeing a lot more of 256 colour VGA games. Red Baron, King's Quest V, Prince of Persia, Wing Commander, and Xenon 2 here all supported VGA. The games that were released in EGA often got an upgrade to VGA. A lot of games were now being developed exclusively for the PC and being ported to the Amiga, Atari ST and others afterwards. One game of 1990 was a massive standout to me. Lucasfilm was the mastermind of The Secret of Monkey Island. Almost 30 years ago to the day, Ron Gilbert and his team brought this piece of adventure game perfection to our screens. I ranted and raved about this game on my 1990 roundup, so if you want a bit of detail on why this game was the standout winner for that year, go back and see that video. The TLDR though is that it's a game that has the perfect blend of humour, storyline, difficulty, length, music and graphics. The final year in the first decade of the PC saw an almost overnight change. The games that were released in this year all looked so much more polished than the years before. Game studios had popped up all over the place. Gaming was now a multi-million-dollar industry, and the PC platform was a platform that was now a big part of that. I opened the video with 4D boxing, which was pretty revolutionary in graphics and playability. The Terminator was also a Grand Theft Auto 5 for the early 90s. More simulators came out, including flight sims and sandboxes such as Civilization, which was huge. First-person shooters were in their infancy, with Catacomb 3D and Hover Tank 3D paving the way for Wolfenstein 3D the following year. Adventure games continue to be big, with Monkey Island 2 being a well-respected follow-up to the all-time classic. Leisure Suit Larry 5 also saw Sierra introduce their latest version of their SCI platform, which finally replaced typing commands with an icon-based control system, aligning it with Lucasfilm's interface. 1991 was a massive year for the 2D platformer games Commander Keen, the Blues Brothers, and Gods. Then there were some absolutely unique titles such as Another World, and I finished the #1 slot of 1991 with the timeless classic Lemmings. So there you go, 10 years of PC video gaming classics. I started out each video over the decade without looking ahead. I played the games of each year separately over the months that it took me to put these videos together, and now looking back at them all in this compilation video, it's fun to see how the platform grew up. The game started from really humble beginnings. It wasn't like there were many big companies like Atari behind the initial games that came out for the PC. They had their own platforms to make money with. Most of the games in the early days were from hobbyists and small indie companies. It was commonplace to see games that imitated or blatantly copied other successful commercial titles. Nobody got sued back in those days, it would seem. And then, as the 80s progressed, the games started to grow up. The hardware matured, and by around 1987, it was clear that the industry was taking the PC very seriously. By 1991, the innocence of the 80s games was almost a distant memory, and for a company that came to the home computer market late and was known for a serious business-only computing vendor, IBM opened a platform that endured to this day. Like them or loathe them, Commodore Amiga or Atari ST fan till you die, you have to give something to IBM. They made the platform that won in the end. I almost feel sad for them. Thanks for joining me on this journey down memory lane. I do hope that you've enjoyed watching it as much as I've enjoyed making it. If you've liked this video or the other videos in this series, don't forget to check out the other videos on my channel. I'll give you that old YouTube cliche too. Don't you forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Seriously though, I really appreciate your subscriptions. I've really enjoyed your comments throughout this series. It's like a little recognition to me that what I'm doing is continuing to be the right stuff. If you want to drop me a wee donation, for example, to help fund more investment in my videos, pay a month's worth of bloody expensive Adobe Premiere Pro subscription, help me save up for a green screen, better mic, or other studio goodness, then you can hit me up at patreon.com/AlsGeekLab, or grab me a coffee on Ko-Fi at ko-fi.com/AlsGeekLab. That's all for today. Thank you very much for watching. Take care and be excellent to each other. Cheers!